Good evening and welcome to the world today. Tonight my guest is Mirza Waheed, a Kashmiri journalist and a very fine novelist, and we're going to discuss a subject that we have discussed before on this program once or twice, the subject of Kashmir, a largish country occupied mainly by India and partially by Pakistan since 1947, and a country where struggles have continued for a long, long time, with the Kashmiri people fighting for the right to self-determination that they were promised long years ago, almost 70 years ago now, by the then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and a promise that has never been fulfilled. And in the meantime, the face of Kashmir has changed, its politics have changed, and the murders and assaults and the occupation by the Indian Army has continued apace with unbelievable, incredible, horrific stories of the regular rape of women, young and old, of young men being tortured, of disappeared bodies and disappeared people. This has been going on for a long, long time. And it's virtually ignored by the world. I think one has to say that very bluntly, that these are not crimes that are noticed by the world because India is too important a country, both for the United States of America, also for Pakistan. Whatever the Pakistanis may have done or not done over recent years, India is a very important country for them. It's an important trading partner, potential trading partner for the People's Republic of China. The countries which are generally speaking in the good books of what is euphemistically called the international community, but which is actually the United States of America and its European Union cronies. These countries and their atrocities are ignored. So I'm going to start by reading the Afterword from Mirza Waheed's first novel, The Collaborator, set in Kashmir, a very strong political novel. This is the Afterword, which is compiled from the figures given by human rights civil society groups in India. More than 70,000 people have been killed in Kashmir since 1989. Around 8,000 people have disappeared. At least 23,000 children have been orphaned, and over 4,000 people are in Indian prisons. Thousands of women have been widowed in the conflict, including 2,000 half-widows whose husbands remain missing. Mirza Waheed, welcome to the show. Explain to me why, in your opinion, this issue remains absolutely central to the people of Kashmir, and it keeps getting worse and worse.
The main reason is the territorialist, cartographic obsession that India and Pakistan have. They treat Kashmir as a territory to be carved between the two countries. The people of Kashmir were promised a plebiscite, a referendum to decide their future by none other than India's first Prime Minister on the floor of the Indian Parliament, as well as in the United Nations, where there is a charter that lists Kashmir as an international dispute. Kashmiris, by and large, since 1947, 1948, have been waiting for that hour so that they are allowed to determine their future by a referendum, by a plebiscite, whatever we call it, to exercise their right to self-determination. India has historically denied this right, which means generation after generation of Kashmiris, frustrated, fed up, when they see no hope, come out on the streets to protest against Indian occupation of Kashmir, against daily excesses and the larger historic cruelty inflicted upon them. So when I was growing up in the 1980s, late 80s and early 90s, there was a full-scale armed uprising against Indian rule because, as we all know, Kashmir is also the most militarized region in the world. It's got more troops than probably double the number of troops than were there in Iraq at the peak of American occupation of Iraq. Some estimates put that we have a soldier to every 16 or 17 civilians in Kashmir.
Say that again. One Indian soldier for every 16 or 17 Kashmir.
If you add up the numbers, Indian regular army, paramilitaries and police, we are talking about upwards of 700,000 military personnel. Now, if you imagine there is a civilian population which is covered, which is besieged by this massive, massive military machine, but not just besieged, also interspersed. They are in civilian areas. Indian military forces, Indian military personnel were engaged in battles by Kashmiri militants, but when India decided to crack down on the insurgency, the bulk of the punishment, the collective punishment, was inflicted upon the the population of Kashmir. So if you do that to a population, they're not going to be fond of you. That's one. Two, their historical grievance is still unresolved. They want to be heard. They want a seat on the table. What India has historically done is it's denied the Kashmiris the right to self-determination. Pakistan, the Pakistani official narrative for long parts of history is that Kashmir is jugular vein. They change a little bit in recent years where they say, okay, Kashmiris should be allowed to determine their future and their destiny. But when it comes to talking to India, both countries, I think, are involved in this bilateral chess game, so to speak, without any regard to that there are these civilians. As we speak right now, day before yesterday, Indian paramilitaries killed an 11-year-old boy. Nasir is his name. His body was found on the outskirts of Srinagar. Srinagar is a beautiful city. And his body was found near a very well-known reservoir of water, and it had hundreds of pellets in his body. And an 11-year-old boy is a child. You can't, when you inflict such unspeakable violence on a generation after generation, there cannot be any rapprochement. There cannot be any reconciliation, so to speak, unless you respect the primary fundamental right of a population to determine their future.
This is, of course, absolutely true. But one of the things you said interested me, because I think just over the last 6 months, we have seen a revival of the mass movement in some ways. You see, it was easy for the Indian government, especially after the triumph of the jihadis backed by the Americans and the Pakistanis in Afghanistan, to say that everything that is happening in Kashmir is being the result of Pakistani intervention. And we know, apart from the training, that some people were infiltrated from the right-wing jihadi groups created in Afghanistan. But that, I'm told, there was a pullback on that in recent years. So that these days, especially over the last 2 years, it's not correct to say that this is all the fault of the Pakistanis, who are capable of anything, in my opinion, but they're not capable of rousing a mass movement. No. They've never been able to do that. So this is a totally genuine movement.
It is indigenous. Even in the 90s, it was indigenous. Yes, there was infiltration from Pakistan. Yes, Pakistan also did not like the direction towards which the Kashmiri struggle for self-determination was moving, because it was primarily independentist. They wanted groups that favor a merger with Pakistan to be dominant. They wanted the pro-independence groups to take a back seat, and there was an internecine war between militant groups. I am witness to it, which in the long run has harmed,
I agree.
But going back to your question, which is very, very important, right now as we speak, people have been coming on the streets since the 9th of July, which is more than 2.5 months, knowing they're going to be shot at, that the paramilitaries will shoot to kill, and yet thousands have come onto the streets in defiance, but not as an expression of nihilist protest, but this is a very, very political statement that we will not agree to this. It's a proper uprising.
Yes,
Tariq.
no, that's what it looks like. The
Yes.
scale of it is that.
I agree. It's a proper,
And when people lose their fear of death, normally in history, they can more or less achieve anything.
that is
Sooner or later.
Yeah, that's it. But it seems to not have. There is a hardening of attitudes within the Indian political establishment, more so than the 90s. In the 90s, the Indian military apparatus came down heavily on the insurgency and on the mass uprising, killing thousands. A Guardian investigation a couple of years ago revealed that one in 6 Kashmiris has faced some kind of torture. Now, these are figures that are not really spoken about in the world. For reasons you mentioned earlier, India is far too important a country and far too important a market, as you said. 1 in every 6 has faced some kind of torture. More than 100,000 people have PTSD. When we talk about PTSD in the Western press, you will talk about PTSD of soldiers who go to enforce illegal wars, for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And yeah, PTSD is horrible. There's more than 100,000 people in Kashmir. There's a recent report in Al Jazeera which mentions so many Kashmiris suffer psychological trauma. This is what they've seen all these years. So this is an entire population. When in the Indian press, sections of the Indian press, every night they would broadcast these, they get these voices which are experts in demonizing the Kashmiri Muslim as a jihadist, as an Islamist, as
everything is put together in a big sort of wave of Islamophobia, which is sweeping not just the world but also India, as we know from what has been going on since Modi's election. And before.
But more so since the election of Mr. Modi, because there seems to be this, now there's a license. There has been violence against Indian Muslims. It has increased. It was there before, one has to always remember. It's not a creation of the Modi government, but it has increased to very dangerous levels where people are literally lynched in broad daylight on mere suspicion of having eaten a kind of meat, which is beef. Kashmiris right now see the response of the Indian state. They can't separate it from the dispensation in Delhi. They see it as a Hindutva government. They see it as a Hindu nationalist government, punishing Kashmiri Muslims for rising up against India. It is quite complex as well, but I would completely agree with you when you said, Tariq, that this is an indigenous mass uprising.
Yeah.
Pakistan is not behind the mass uprising. Pakistan, yes, Pakistani security establishment, definitely parts of the security establishment have nursed militant groups, terror groups even, and there has been a blowback which has hit Pakistan itself. And some of these groups, their main currency is Kashmir, is the jihad in Kashmir. But that does not take away anything from the fact that these are Kashmiri boys and girls and young men and women and old people. Yesterday there was a nightly raid in villages. They raid villages at night just to harass people, just to intimidate people. They identify pockets of resistance, and there are these nightly raids where windows are broken, property is damaged, young men taken away, beaten up, tortured. But I like to think it is not sustainable. The response of the Indian state is completely counterproductive.
But you say that, but I think one of the things that would make it totally counterproductive, if a mass opposition to this butchery and carnage emerged inside India itself. It doesn't matter who starts it, whether it's Muslims or secular people of Hindu origin or whoever. But this has been another side of it, which I find quite disturbing, that in India it's left, it's progressive intellectuals. Of course, there are some very courageous ones who have spoken up, and I wouldn't take anything away from them, but we know them. Most of them are personal friends. So it's not that there are huge numbers of people doing all this. And I find this very reprehensible.
But do you think there should have been a bigger, larger response to what is happening in India?
Yes.
From within Indian civil
Absolutely.
society?
I mean, this is your country, your government. Okay, many people say we didn't elect it. That's true. But lots of Americans didn't elect Bush when he invaded Iraq. Yet millions came out on the streets of the United States to protest what was being done to Iraq. This is exactly the same thing in this
happened
country.
in London in 2003.
We had, over 1 million people marching against a Labour government, Tony Blair. So why isn't this? I mean, lots of other things from the West are very popular in India. As we know, they mimic the West all the time, especially the middle classes and lots of university kids. Why not mimic this solidarity with people your country is oppressing? Why not come out onto the street and say we demand an end? I mean, even when there was action taken against the young people, students in JNU, for saying a few things, they retreated very quickly on this issue, not on other things. But if patriotism means accepting what is being done in the name of secularism or whatever in Kashmir, it's unacceptable.
So, but why do you think people haven't marched on the streets protesting their government, that what you're doing to Dalits, for instance, there's daily violence inflicted upon Dalits and on Indian Muslims, and unspeakable violence on Kashmir. Kashmir seems to be, there seems complete license that you can do whatever you want to do to those people. I do not remember reading or seeing an instance where a democratic state, a country, a modern nation state, has willfully, systematically shot at people to blind them. More than 500 people have these little lead pellets in their eyes.
To blind them deliberately.
That is not an accident. That is not a crowd control tactic gone wrong. These are young people. This girl who has sadly become the face of this new, completely brutal tactic, Insha, this 14-year-old girl, Insha Malik.
I read about it.
She may lose vision in both her sides. She was not even a protester. And that is, but I want to emphasize, not that you're supposed to blind a protester. She wasn't even a protester, she was at home. She's lost both her eyes. Now, then, to come back to your question, why wouldn't a large mass of Indian civil society activists or thinkers or students or journalists protest this? They have, they have, but not in the numbers you suggest.
Well, I think the reason for that is this, that effectively, if we go back to the beginning, this mess in Kashmir was created by India's very first national government after independence. That it was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the hero of the Indian left, not the right, but the Indian left, the progressive left, the liberals. He was the one who finally put his foot down and said they're not having Kashmir. I mean, when the whole subcontinent was being divided on the basis of allowing people with Muslim majorities to decide their future, you stay with India or Pakistan, why didn't they let the Kashmiris vote on this? Because I fear they had no confidence in themselves, even though a large section of Kashmiri civil society was totally secular and supported Sheikh Abdullah. Even then they didn't have the confidence to do it. So
there was a betrayal as well.
Yeah.
There was because Nehru had himself said, we will not hold these people against their will.
Yeah.
And then he went back on this promise.
Yeah. But okay, so I think that was the starting point. It was Nehru who did it. Mahatma Gandhi, the great pacifist worshipped as such, authorized and approved the sending of Indian troops to Kashmir. Just a fact, it's on the record. Sheikh Abdullah, a secular leader of Kashmir, backed Nehru, demanding a plebiscite, a demand which was acceded to. And so many people in India, celebrating independence despite the carnage which was taking place in Bengal and the Punjab, said, okay, this is a special case, let's accept it. And the constitution has said that the Indian constitution then later said Kashmir is special. It's not like any other part of India. So these concessions were made, and I think that completely calmed down let's say for a start the Indian Communist Party, which would have been the obvious party of the left to fight for the right of Kashmiris. It's not that they didn't have any support in Kashmir, they did. They were also close to Sheikh Abdullah. They didn't do that, and so they got into a rut. And then after the India-Pak, the short war, it became part of defending the security of India against reactionary theocracy. And they found all sorts of justifications for not doing it. So I do hold the Indian left partially, of course, the main fault is not theirs, but partially responsible for this lack of an understanding in India's progressive circles and progressive intelligentsia of what was being done in Kashmir.
But now we've come to a point where it is quite depressing. The voices of sanity are getting fewer and fewer in India. There is a fight back from certain circles in India, from some writers and intellectuals and journalists. But the numbers are shrinking because there is this atmosphere of fear. Because what has happened is Mr. Modi's government, they have let loose these bunch of vigilantes who go against writers, who go against anyone who is basically different, whether it's the Dalit or the Muslim or a student who has different views, as we know will happen in JNU. So it is quite worrying, but with regard to Kashmir, the Indian state's response is quite horrific. And it is not sustainable, because what you're essentially doing is generation after generation of Kashmiris are brought up on this memory of humiliation, of brutal violence, of being treated as not even as a normal human being. They are treated as cattle. And Kashmir is a very political place, and there's no surprises there. Everyone is political. Young girls and boys are political. They understand politics better than pundits on primetime TV, I like to think. Their memory of their existence is to do with this. Who did this to us? Who did this to us in 2016? Who blinded these young boys and girls? And for them, it is very clear, it is the Indian state. As a writer, I will obviously make distinctions, one shouldn't have to say this, but these are times where, in our increasingly binary world, we have to say such things as to make distinctions between state and the people, the state and the country, and so on and so forth. But the Indian state at the moment is seen as a brutal occupier in Kashmir and nothing more than that.
No, and it's perfectly justifiable. Add to this the fact that were these atrocities being committed by, let us say for the sake of argument, on this scale by the Taliban, what would have been the reaction? A Nobel Peace Prize was given to that young woman who was badly injured in a terrorist attack on a single schoolgirl's bus. And she's very courageous, and I like her. So I'm not grudging her that. But I'm saying that that was the reaction on one attack. Whereas in Kashmir, this sort of thing is going on every single day. Or if you compare it also to the attacks made on the Chinese for what they do in Tibet, which again is not something I'm justifying. I'm just saying you compare the reaction to these two different cases, the Taliban or the Chinese in Tibet, who are not doing anything on this scale. Let's be clear about that. And there's horror and shock, and the whole Western world goes mad, and Hollywood's finest become Buddhists, and all this sort of stuff goes on. When things on a much, much larger scale happen in Kashmir, silence. We don't know about it. We don't want to know about it, because these atrocities are being committed by a country which we regard as friendly. And which is a democratic country.
Yes. So
that's the thing. Anyway, it's good talking. Let's come to your novels. You have chosen as your weapon, large numbers of young people who live there fight back with guns. You have chosen the pen and produced two very fine political novels, one of which I haven't completed, but I will. What turned you in this direction?
Tough question, actually. As I said, I grew up in Kashmir. This is what you see as a child, your influences, your sensibility. And if you have delusions of being a writer, or you have this illusion that you have things to say, but if your formative influences are army flag marches outside your house, or bullets whizzing past your roof, or corpses that you see as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, in my neighborhood. And when you're a teenager and you are it's impossible for you not to be affected if you have a slightly sensitive sort of mind. And this is what I saw, but not just me, everyone. As I keep going, so this Kashmiri generations, Kashmiri youth, many of them come onto the streets to protest against Indian rule. From those big pools of anger and resentment, political anger, I have to make sure, some people choose to take up arms because they see no hope. They say that after year 2000, when Kashmiri militancy was waning, fewer and fewer numbers, Kashmiri people turned towards a peaceful protest movement. In 1990, as I remember, I was a student at a lovely, lovely place called 1989 Gandhi Memorial College. And then overnight, everything erupted. There was a massive, massive mass movement and militant movement. And various things happened. There were massacres, there were tortures, people you knew, people you played cricket with went across to become militants, people you went to school with faced torture, went into dungeons, came back brutalized. And that forms your sensibility. So when you grow up and you want to write a novel, I couldn't possibly write about the shikaras and the beautiful honeymoons on the Dal Lake. And I would love to, there's a nod to that kind of framework in my second book, because we grew up also watching the India we saw in Kashmir was the Bollywoodized Indian, where we also saw the Kashmiri native represented as either the boatman or the cook or the chef or the horsewala, godawala, or the local native bumpkin, basically, the simpleton sometimes. And when you grow up and you begin to read a little bit, you find everything wrong, and you say, "My goodness, what is this?" And then you have ambitions of trying to write a novel. And in 2006, I wrote this first novel in London, and I had written sketches and little stories, but most of them would focus on these little bits. I remember in 1990 we had this exodus of Kashmiri Pandits who were killed by some militant groups. And in an atmosphere of fear and horror, really, they had to leave home almost in an overnight exodus. And I went to a college which was run by Kashmiri Pandits. It was a nice institute, and I have not recovered those friends. These are Kashmiri Hindus. And there's another side, devastating, tragic side to the Kashmir. And I treat all these things as part of the same complex moment of rupture in Kashmir. So when I started to write, I had this premise in my head because if I, as a teenager, saw corpses in an urban setting in Srinagar, which is an old city and a nice city, and if you saw dead bodies on the road and you were expected to behave normally, that concept never left my head. Even when I grew up and I was in my 20s, it had stayed in my head. And then I realized this is what forms you as a person, what you see as a young person. And then you read, and then you have ambitions. And one night in London, I decided to write about dead bodies if they are somewhere, hidden away in a gorge. Because I took that image that I had seen near my neighborhood in Srinagar, by the Dal Lake, by the famous Dal Lake, literally, and transported it to the mountains. That's how the collaborator was born, that if there are these unclaimed, unburied young men hidden in these gorges and valleys, what does it mean to be that dead person? What does it mean to be looking at those dead people? Also, what does it mean to be the person doing that? What does it mean to be the person who executes that kind of horrific violence? So those questions bother you as a young person, and you don't have answers really. So,
Mr. Waheed, thank you very much, and more power to your pen.
Thank you, Tariq Sahab. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.